are still climbing, guys, so I'm going to hang in there for just another 30 seconds. All right, it looks like we can begin now. The people are still coming, but let's get started. I know everyone has a busy Friday ahead of them. Welcome to this REA presentation of what you need to know about the Trust in Real Estate Services Act. My name is Ray Ferris, and like each and every one of you, I'm a realtor. I've been a realtor for 28 years. I own my own small boutique brokerage on the North Shore of Lake Erie. So if you guys are wondering what in the world does a practicing realtor happen to know about Ontario's new real estate legislation, let me share with you how I've come to know this information that we're going to walk through this morning. When the government of Ontario decided to modernize the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act, it reached out to its stakeholders, REA being its largest real estate stakeholder in the province, and let us know that they were going to bounce some ideas off of us about things that they thought should change within REA. And they wanted to know where we thought real estate legislation could be improved. And to facilitate that process, REA struck a task force, and I was appointed chair of that task force. So I've been doing this stuff, guys, for 3 or 4 years. And I say that to let you know that the information I'm going to share with you today is first-hand information. And that's very important because when I scroll social media, I see a lot of things said about TRESA that actually aren't correct. We've had a front row seat with the government and with the Real Estate Council of Ontario to discuss these changes. And that's why I'm so confident that the information we're sharing with you today is the correct information. As I mentioned, I'm a realtor, I'm not a lawyer, so none of this information should be considered legal advice. But more importantly than that, is that I'm going to use a lot of real estate examples. I'm not going to sit here and read from a law textbook. I use those real estate examples to paint a picture for you how these new regulations can work in practice. Sometimes my real estate examples might be different than your brokerage policies allow. And if that is the case, obviously you have to adhere to your brokerage policies. If you've been following the rollout of TRESA, you are well aware that these changes aren't minor. This is a significant overhaul of REA. And because it's so huge, the government broke this down into 3 phases. They did that to make it manageable. They broke it down into bite-sized pieces. Phase 1 has already been in effect for 3 years. 3 years as of this month, as a matter of fact. I'm going to review really quickly for you what occurred as a result of phase 1. We're going to spend the majority of our time together talking about what you need to know in just over 2 short weeks when TRESA comes into effect. And then, guys, the government's going to continue this conversation. They want to make some further changes or consider some further changes sometime in 2024. And you will be invited to participate in that conversation, just like you were invited to participate in phases 1 and 2. Your real estate board, REA, and REGO all reached out to you and said, what do you think about these ideas for modernizing REA? Some of you no doubt participated in that. So stay tuned to future emails if you want to chime in and have your say about future changes to TRESA. At the conclusion of today's presentation, guys, in any remaining time we have left together, I'll take questions. REA staff is going to ask you questions at the conclusion. So to facilitate that process, simply type your questions into the chat as you think of them. Now, I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions in our time together, but don't worry, REA has your back. I'm going to show you how you can get any of your questions asked and answered from REA, whether those questions are today, tonight, tomorrow, next week, or next year. So let's dive in, guys. As you're aware, the implementation date for TRESA is December 1. That is the drop dead date. This date will not change. And I say it won't change because some of you maybe you recall that the initial implementation date was April 1. And the government paused that implementation date. And they did it for one reason. That is because REA reached out to the government and said, hey, while these changes are being considered, we'd like to have a conversation with you about allowing designated representation here in the province. That is something REA had been lobbying for as far back as 2017. And the good news, guys, is that the government agreed to have that conversation. And that's why the brakes were put on the implementation. But they won't change again. December 1 is the date. The website that I just circled on your screens for you is a very important website. I'm going to refer to it a couple of times throughout today's presentation, but more importantly than that, it is your one-stop shop for all things TRESA beyond today. And I'm going to talk about that in particular at the conclusion of today's presentation. So let's have a quick review of what was achieved 3 years ago when Phase 1 of TRESA was rolled out. First, after many years of lobbying, the provincial government decided that it was okay for realtors to create personal real estate corporations, something REA had lobbied for years. Lawyers could create practice, so could an accountant. So as a matter of fairness, REA asked the government to consider allowing realtors to also form CRECs, and they agreed. So since October of 2020, guys, any of us can create a personal real estate corporation. And why would we want to do that? Well, it in fact allows us to access the business advantages of incorporation. And with that, there are significant tax and income planning benefits. They are really beneficial to high-income producing realtors. And as a matter of fact, since CRECs have been allowed in Ontario, well over 12,000 Ontario realtors have in fact created their own personal real estate corporation. So if you're curious about CRECs, if you want more information, whether or not they're right for you, and if so, how to set one up, just simply go to that REA website that I introduced. There's lots of information and guidance there that will answer your questions about personal real estate corporations. The second thing that came about as a result of Phase 1 is new descriptors for registrants to refer to themselves in their marketing. So if you were registered as a salesperson under REA prior to October of 2020, you will recall that you always had to refer to yourself as a real estate salesperson or a real estate sales representative, right? At REA, we said to the government, look, consumers rarely call us salespeople or sales representatives. More often than not, they call us real estate agents and sometimes realtors. So we said, if that's how consumers are referring to us as, we should be able to use those terms. And the government agreed. So since October of 2020, if you want to use those old descriptors, you still can. But you can now use those terms, real estate agent or realtor, in your marketing. And I've noticed that most of us, in fact, are now calling ourselves realtor in our marketing. Brokers of record like myself, we still have to call ourselves brokers of record. Those two changes are directly as a result of Phase 1 of TRESA. Let's advance to what we're going to talk about this morning. Here's the 8 key changes to our business practice come December 1. The first thing is a new code of ethics. Then number 2, we're going to look at the elimination of customers from real estate legislation. Number 3, the way we make disclosures as of December 1 is changing a little bit. This is an easy change, guys. Then number 4, I'm going to let you know what your obligations are with regards to a new document in real estate titled the Information Guide. And then number 5, REA's Discipline Committee has been beefed up. It's got greater strength and authority. Number 6, my favorite part of this morning's presentation is the ability of sellers come December 1 to share the terms of competing offers. And then number 7, what we put into our written agreements with our clients has some new requirements. I'm going to let you know what they are. And then we're going to end with a discussion of designated rep. So let's dive into the new code of ethics. So right now, guys, our code of ethics under REBA is 11 or 12 pages long. And the reason that it's so big is because it's a mix of principle-based rules and technical requirements. Ontario Realtors have long said that the code is so big, it's so burdensome, that it's incredibly difficult to navigate. So a key ask of AREA was to make the code of ethics more reader-friendly. And that's what we will have on December 1. The new code of ethics is 2 pages long. That's it. How did it get so much smaller? Well, all of those principle-based rules and technical requirements are moved out of the code of ethics. They're put somewhere else in the legislation. The code of ethics, as of December 1, will speak to those principle-based articulating requirements that we have to comply with surrounding matters of integrity, quality of service, and conflicts of interest. That sounds like a code of ethics, doesn't it? I'm not going to show you the code of ethics. I'm not going to review the entire document together, but if you would like to see it, go to that website that I mentioned off the top, orea.com/TRESA, and you can click on the code of ethics hyperlink and you can review the entire code. Where we're going to spend a lot of time in the next few minutes is with regards to the elimination of customer relationships from legislation come December 1. So right now in REBA, there's 2 consumer relationships. Those are clients and customers, right? When we were consulting with the government, they told us that real estate consumers are oftentimes confused about the differences between being a client and a customer. The government doesn't want that confusion to exist. They want real estate relationships to be black and white, to be crystal clear, to be understood by consumers. They want to get rid of that confusion. They don't want this to be gray any longer. So here's how they've done that. As of December 1, customers cease to exist altogether. Full stop. They're gone. Clients, on the other hand, will continue to exist exactly the way they do now. The duties and obligations you owe clients within TRESA are exactly what you owe them today. There's no change to client. But then, right in TRESA, there's this new animal introduced in real estate called self-represented party. So by way of summary, as of December 1, no more customer relationships. You're either a client or you're self-represented. And I need to be clear, self-represented party is not a simple name change for customer. Self-represented party is very different from being a customer. So on that note, let's take a deep dive into a self-represented party. And a self-represented party is defined very simply within TRESA. A self-represented party is simply a party who is not a client of any brokerage. That's easy, isn't it? They're not clients. Remember when I said self-represented party is very different from being a customer? Let me introduce one of those significant differences. So right now, the brokerage can enter into a written agreement with a customer, right? We can do that today. Our brokerage can enter into a written agreement with a customer. Fast forward to December 1, the brokerage cannot enter into a written agreement with any consumer unless they're a client. Therefore, brokerages cannot enter into written agreements with self-represented parties the way we can today with customers. So you may say, well, what does that mean? Why does that matter? Let me roll out a real life example. Let's say today I'm working with a buyer client, and my buyer client expresses interest in a for sale by owner. So today I'll approach that for sale by owner. And I'll say to the for sale by owner, will you allow me to show your house? And if I sell it, will you pay me? And oftentimes FSBOs say, sure, if you can net me what I want in my pocket, I will pay you. And how do I get paid? How do I contract with that FSBO, who's not a client, are they? So therefore, they're a self-represented party. FSBOs are true self-represented parties. How do I get paid? I have that FSBO signed today, a customer service agreement for a property not listed for sale. Remember what I said, however. We cannot enter into written agreements with self-represented parties on December 1 or after. Do you see the ramifications of that? We can no longer get paid directly from a self-represented party. And in my example, that would be the FSBO. So guys, I know what you're wondering. How in the world, Ray, do I get paid in a situation like you just described? And that's just one self-represented example of many. There's lots of others. So let me help you understand how you could get paid in that example of a buyer client and a FSBO. Well, we all know that we can rely upon the terms of a BRA to get paid directly from the buyer, can't we? But I also know, as a practicing realtor, I'm in the trenches with you guys each and every day. I know that relying upon a BRA isn't always possible. It's not always reasonable, is it? For example, a first-time home buyer might only have 5% down payment, and that's it to be able to make a purchase. They don't have thousands of extra dollars to pay our fees, do they? So that's not always reasonable. So here's a REA's recommendation when you're interacting with a self-represented party. Again, think of my example of a FSBO and a buyer client. You can ask that FSBO to sign an agreement where you might limit their services. Rather than a full-blown listing agreement that we use today, you may say to that FSBO, look, I'm offering to provide you one service. That's it, just one service. And that service is I'm going to bring you an offer for your consideration. That's it. And if I sell your property, you're going to pay me. Right? So in a listing agreement, you can reduce the services that you're providing to one simple service. But guys, do you see what happened when I had that FSBO, a self-represented party, sign an agreement? They became a client, didn't they? That FSBO is now a client. They are no longer self-represented. Because remember, you cannot enter into a written agreement with anybody other than a client. You can't enter into a written agreement with an SRP. So because the FSBO just became a client, and I have a buyer client, what do I have now? We have multiple representation, don't we? Guys, remember off the top I said I hear a lot of things said on social media and around the water cooler about TRESA that's not correct. One of those things that I hear is that multiple representation is not prohibited in TRESA. And that's not true. Multiple representation is alive and well December 1 and afterwards. Now you have to practice multiple rep the same way you do today. That is, you have to make the clients who find themselves in a multiple representation situation aware of the fact that this is multiple rep. This is what multiple rep looks like, and here's how your services are going to change. And you need to get their written permission. So I want to clear the air about that. Multiple rep exists if you practice it as per those requirements that I just highlighted. So there's your solution. In that particular type of example, how you can get paid when you're helping somebody who was a self-represented party. And we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. At this point, guys, we need to answer the big question, the big elephant in the room, which is, what in the world can we do with an SRP? The legislation defines that for us. And I'm going to walk you through this. It's a little bit difficult to grasp. I promise you I will bring it home for you in future slides. You need to zero in on that bullet point number 3 on your screen. This is your golden nugget of information pertaining to SRPs. The legislation sets out a 2-step test, if you will, that will guide you in what you can do to help a self-represented party. And guys, I use the word help on purpose. All you can do for an SRP is provide them with assistance or help. You don't represent them. You don't give them services. All you're doing is helping them. So on that note, let's zero in on that two-step test within TRESA. Here's what it says. Here's the first part. You can help a self-represented party as long as that help is an actual service to a client of the brokerage. Let me say that again. You can assist a self-represented party as long as that assistance is a help to a client of the brokerage. So let's use an example. Let's say there's a buyer out there in the marketplace who, for whatever reason, does not want to be a client. They want to be self-represented. They say to you, I can do all of this stuff on my own rate. I don't want to be a client. Okay, fine. I respect that decision. And that self-represented buyer says, I want to look at that property you have listed for sale, that your brokerage is offering for sale. So my question is, can I show that self-represented buyer our brokerage's listing? Well, obviously the answer is yes, right? Showing our seller client's property is in fact a service to a client of the brokerage. The next part is going to be a little bit gray, guys, but like I said, I'm going to try to make it crystal clear in our coming slides. The second part of this two-step process says any help, any assistance that you give to a self-represented party must not use your skill or your judgment. Well, what in the heck does that mean? Your skill and your judgment is really opinions, advice, and services, right? So let me use another real estate example. That same self-represented buyer who chooses to do all these things on their own, they don't want representation, looks at my brokerage's listing, and when we're done looking at it, she says to me, Ray, I love it. I think I'm going to buy it. I think I'm going to make an offer, but before I do so, I need you to help me better understand market value here. I need you to prepare a CMA for me as a buyer to help me understand what it's worth. My question to you guys is this. Can I prepare that CMA for that self-represented buyer? Well, let's look at the second part of that two-step process in TRESA, which says any help you give to an SRP must not use your skill or your judgment. So let me ask you guys this. Is selecting properties that have sold, are looking for listings that have sold that are truly comparable to the subject property using your skill or your judgment? It does, doesn't it? So you cannot provide a CMA in that example to a self-represented buyer because it uses your skill and judgment. We're going to come back to this in a few minutes, guys. At this point, before you help a self-represented party, you need to provide them with a couple of documents. The first one is called the information guide. However, the information guide isn't just for SRPs, it's for every real estate consumer. But more about that in a few minutes. Let's focus in on a document that is unique to just SRPs. And it's a self-represented party acknowledgement form. So if you've got a consumer who chooses to be self-represented in a real estate transaction, before you give them any help, you've got to review this disclosure form with them. And guys, both the information guide and this disclosure document must be authored by RICO. That's what TRESA says. So OREA, who creates all those wonderful forms we use in our day-to-day businesses, the listing agreement, the BRA, won't be creating either the info guide or this disclosure document because TRESA says it must be authored by the Real Estate Council of Ontario. So let's then look at what TRESA says has to be on this disclosure document. And while I keep referring to it as the SRP acknowledgement form, RICO in fact is calling it information and disclosure to a self-represented party. And there's a screenshot, guys, for you of this actual document. It's available on RICO's website if you'd like to look at it in its entirety. It's a 2-page document. Page 2 is really a signature section. But let me walk you through what this document has in it. First, guys, it's a disclosure to the consumer that chooses to be self-represented. That's all it is. It's a disclosure. And it discloses to the consumer who chooses to be self-represented that the brokerage, in fact, represents a client in connection with this transaction. And oh, by the way, that's not you. You have decided to be self-represented. You are not our client in any shape, form, or fashion. As a matter of fact, we represent the other party in connection with this transaction. It's loudly and clearly a bold statement that says we don't represent you. Then, guys, the form goes on to explain to the self-represented party the risks that they're subjecting themselves to when they choose not to be a client. It tells them this is a risky decision that you're making to not be represented by a real estate brokerage. You need to fully understand your decision is loaded with risk. Then, guys, the form goes on to describe the type of assistance that we're able to offer to the self-represented party. That's not going to be a list of the type of activities we can provide to a self-represented party. You guys already know what this is. We talked about it already in the previous slide. This is that golden nugget. It's that two-step process in TRESA that says the brokerage can help you only because the help that they're giving you is a service to their client. And oh, by the way, any help that the brokerage gives you will not rely on their skill or judgment. And then, guys, the form actually recommends to the self-represented party that they consider obtaining independent professional advice. I know automatically we all think that means legal advice, right? And today, consumers sometimes say to us, Ray, I don't want to sign anything until my lawyer reviews it. That's cool, that's okay. That's one type of professional advice this form refers to. That also might mean independent professional advice from another real estate brokerage. Now let me be clear, guys. The legislation can't force a self-represented party to get independent professional advice. This is a recommendation. This is no different than when we say to buyer clients, we recommend you get a home inspection. And sometimes they say thanks, but no thanks, don't they? They can still decline to get independent professional advice. And then lastly, the regulations require us to ask the consumer, the self-represented party, to acknowledge this document, that is, sign it. So you see the purpose of this form? It's intended to make sure that consumers who choose not to be clients, that choose to be self-represented, fully understand the ramifications of the decision that they've made not to be a client. This self-represented party within legislation is designed to get rid of the confusion that exists today within REBA. So by way of summary, come December 1, you're either a client of the brokerage or your self-represented party. Those two very distinct differences. There should be no room left for confusion. That's the intention here. So I'd encourage you guys to have a look at this form at rico.on.ca because, as I mentioned, it's there. We're going to go through 3 questions here, guys. These questions are really intended to make sure that you fully grasp the differences between customers and SRPs. Let's look at the first one. Can you show another brokerage's listing to an SRP? So let's think back to that 2-step process to answer this. This is what we always have to do, go back to that 2-step process. Let's look at the first part. Any help you give to an SRP must be a service to a client of the brokerage. We've got our answer already in the first part of that process, don't we? Another brokerage's listing is not your client. That seller is not your client. So the answer is no. You cannot show another brokerage's listing to a self-represented party. Let's look at number 2. I'm going to elaborate on what you see on your screen there. So I'm out there in the market. I've got a brand new listing available for sale, and a buyer inquires about it. And I review self-representation and client representation with this buyer, and they choose to be self-represented. They made the decision. It's their decision to be self-represented. So as a service to my seller client, I show them the property that our brokerage has listed for sale. We go and look at it. The buyer says, Ray, I love it. I want to buy it. Let's go back to your office and write up an offer. My question to you guys is this. Can I write that offer for this self-represented buyer as a service to my seller client to make sure that that offer is airtight and bulletproof and entirely favorable to my seller client? And we've got huge numbers on this call today, guys, so normally at this point I'd ask you to write your answer in the Q&A, but we've got so many people here that's going to be problematic. So let's walk through this. Can I write an offer for an SRP? What do we got to do to answer this? Let's go back to that two-step process. Let's look at the first part. Any help you give to a self-represented party must be because it's a service to your actual client. Well, yeah, getting an offer on the table, I think we could all agree, is in fact a service to our seller. Let's look at the next part, which says, any help given to an SRP must not use your skill or judgment. So what's the answer? Can we write an offer for an SRP? Well, let me walk you through this. Is selecting conditions, is selecting clauses, is making sure that the clauses are worded legally and technically correct using our skill and our judgment. It does, doesn't it? So therefore, guys, the answer is no. You cannot use your opinions or advice, your skill or your judgment, to help an SRP buyer write an offer. Let's go to the last question. And again, I'm going to elaborate on it. I listed a new property for sale. I received a call from a buyer about this new listing. I don't know this buyer at all. It's a cold lead. And the buyer asks me some information about my new listing, and when I tell her the price, she says, stop right there, Ray. It's outside of my budget. It's $200,000 more than I can afford. Remember, this buyer's a cold lead. This buyer is not my client, right? So she dismisses my listing because it's outside of her budget. But guess what? I know that there's two other houses for sale on the same street that are lesser priced. They are, in fact, within this buyer's budget. But guess what? Those listings aren't my brokerages. They're available for sale. They're listed for sale with another brokerage. Remember, this is a cold lead. Therefore, this buyer is not a client, right? And remember, we cannot show another brokerage's listing to anybody other than a client. We can't show another brokerage's listing to an SRP. So do I just give up and say, oh no, I can't show other brokerages' listings anymore? That's not the expectation, guys. The expectation is that that buyer lead be a client. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking right now. But Ray, I don't like the hard sell. But Ray, I don't like to ask a buyer to sign a BRA before they know me, before I take them out and show them a few properties, so that they can get to know me, so that they can feel comfortable with me, and get to know that I truly have their back. Right? Like, I know a lot of realtors prefer to build relationships with buyers, in my example, before they ask them to sign the BRA contract. Now, if you're getting a BRA signed before you take buyers out and show them properties, that is the gold standard. That is the best practice. And keep doing what you're doing. That's absolutely professional, top-notch work. But my point here is this, guys. Just because you don't get a BRA signed doesn't mean you don't have a client. It doesn't mean you haven't established agency. Some of you will know what I'm referring to. That is implied agency, right? Remember back to your registration education where we learned about implied agency? Implied agency is still alive and well in TRESA, guys. My point here is, again, you don't need a BRA to establish agency. You can create agency, implied agency, by the things you say and the things you do. We do it all the time today with buyers. If you receive a telephone call from a buyer today who is not your client, it's a cold lead, and the buyer asks you questions and you respond to those questions with answers that use your advice or your opinion, you've created implied agency. And you still had not, at that point, got a BRA signed. So I want to alleviate any fear that you just can't show another brokerage's listings to buyers. You can if you make them clients. And I'm going to create implied agency like this. This is just one example of many. I'll say to that cold lead on the phone, hey, I know of a couple other properties that are currently available for sale in the same neighborhood as my listing that are in fact lesser priced. They are within your budget. Can I tell you about them? And if this is a serious bona fide buyer, she's going to say sure. And then I'm going to say, as a service to you, would you find it beneficial if I let you know the sale prices of properties that have occurred in the neighborhood within the last 90 days? That service is designed to help you better understand current market value. And as realtors, we know that buyers love sold data, don't they? So that buyer's most likely going to say, heck yeah, I want that. And then I'm going to say to the buyer on the phone, when you find a property that you fall in love with that you want to buy, can you write your own real estate contracts? And what's a buyer going to say to that? No, I don't know how to do that. I need you to do that, Ray. The reason that I ask those three little tiny simple questions is to create agency, to get this buyer to agree to receive services from me. And I still haven't introduced the BRA. That will come. But I'm not using the word sell at this point. That's a business practice that many of us choose to make. But I'm not going to stop there, guys. I'm going to send an email to the buyer after our telephone call has ended. The email is going to go something like this. Here's a summary of those properties that are currently available for sale that I mentioned might be of interest to you. Would you like to take a look at them tomorrow night after 6? The next paragraph will be, as per your request, here is a summary of properties that have sold in the neighborhood within the last 90 days. This service is designed to help you better understand market value. And then the last thing I'm going to say, guys, and this is a tease to our next topic, which will in fact help you comply with a new part of TRESA, in which I say, here's a link to some information about real estate that we will review together when we meet for the first time. So you see what I did there? I did things and I said things that created implied representation. Now I want to repeat. You need to get that BRA signed, definitely before offers are signed. You need to get that BRA signed at the earliest practical opportunity. But an implied agency is alive and well. So let's summarize about SRPs. Remember, guys, December 1, customers cease to exist, full stop. As of December 1, you're either a client of the brokerage or you're a nobody. And if you choose to be self-represented, I'm only helping you because it's an actual service to a client of my brokerage. And oh, by the way, any help I give you will not use my skill or my judgment. So I'm sure you guys fully understand now that self-represented party is not a name change for customers. These are two very different animals, aren't they? And then lastly, remember, the brokerage can only enter into written agreements with clients, not self-represented parties. The consequence being, we cannot get paid directly from an SRP the way we could with customers. And I know there's going to be a ton of questions in the chat. Keep typing them. We're going to address as many as we can at the end. Our next topic, guys, this is an easy one. This will go quick, is with regards to disclosures. So there's lots of disclosures in REBA that you're familiar with. Those same disclosures are going to be carried forward into TRESA. There's three little tiny things you need to be aware of when it comes to disclosures in particular. Here they are. First, in the case of a disclosure, there must be prominent placement of the word disclosure. So let's look at the disclosure document on your screen. This is Form 160, the Registrant Disclosure of Interest. This is the form we use, we sign, and our broker of record signs when we as a registrant are purchasing property, right? To disclose to the consumer, we're in fact a registrant under the Act. Do you see the word disclosure on that document prominently displayed? You do? No, it's in the title. It's in a big bold font and in a font size larger than any other text throughout the document. So the title of that document satisfies the prominent placement of the word disclosure. The next thing, guys, is this. Any disclosure we make must be presented in plain language that's clear and concise. So if I'm going to disclose to you the latent defect of a basement that leaks every spring in a spring thaw, that's what I'm going to say. Each and every one of you understood what I just said, didn't you? I didn't sound like a structural engineer. I said the basement leaks every spring in a spring thaw. That's what's meant by plain language. And then lastly, guys, the disclosure must be presented in a way that brings attention to the information that is required to be disclosed. So what does that mean? The disclosure itself can't be buried deep in a document, buried deep within a schedule. It has to be presented in a way where the disclosure jumps off the page to the attention of the reader. So you see the disclosure form on the screen? Do you see a lot of white space there where if I type something in bold, it would catch the reader's attention? You do, don't you? That's all you need to know with regards to disclosures come December 1. And we don't have to worry about this. Why? REA will make sure that its standard forms pertaining to disclosures comply with those 3 little rules. But that was just a summary of what will be required. I do, however, want to zero in on one type of disclosure here, guys, where there's one change, one tiny change, but significant change. And that is pertaining to the disclosure of multiple rep. So the disclosure of multiple rep is not anything new in TRESA. It's required in REA, isn't it? We make the disclosure of multiple rep today. What will be different as of December 1 is the timing of the disclosure. Just the timing, that's it. Everything else remains the same. So here's what I mean by the timing. When the brokerage realizes that it's entering multiple representation, the brokerage needs to slam on the brakes and not take any further steps on behalf of any of the clients involved in multiple rep until we've made them aware that this is multiple rep. Here's the limitations of services in multiple rep, and ask them to consent to proceed in writing. We do those things today, don't we? How do we make the disclosure of multiple rep today? We most often use the confirmation of cooperation and representation, don't we? We check off the multiple representation box. We review that confirmation with the clients, and we get them to acknowledge in writing that they're cool with proceeding, right? That's how we do it today. But what has to be different as of December 1 is the timing of that disclosure. Let me use an example. So let's say you and I work in the same real estate brokerage, and I list a property for sale on behalf of the brokerage today. And when I list that property for sale, the seller says, Ray, I don't want to look at any offers until 5 days from now. I won't entertain a bully offer. And she gives me that written direction in writing on the REA seller's direction. That is her lawful instruction. She initials the no conveyance oval, meaning full stop, no bullies, right? The day I list the property for sale, and remember, you work in the same brokerage with me, you show it to a buyer, and the buyer loves it. So during the showing, the buyer says to you, you know, I love this place. I think I'm going to make an offer. I'm going to go home and think about it over dinner. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to make an offer. I'm going to give you a call back tonight. Right then and there, you have to acknowledge that multiple representation is likely to occur. Right then and there, you need to slam on the brakes and say to that buyer client, hey, because our brokerage has this property listed for sale, this will be multiple representation. This is how the services I can provide you change in multiple rep, which we say now. Are you cool with that? Yes, I'm cool with that. Then you have to get the consumer to consent in writing. Then you're going to need to call me as the listing agent, say, Ray, my buyer's probably going to sign an offer. You need to let your seller know multiple representation is happening. And I'm going to have to, at that point, let the seller know. So we do all of that stuff today, except we probably aren't making the seller in that example aware of multiple rep until the time of the offer presentation 5 days from now, right?
It's only at the offer presentation today do we pull out that confirmation of cooperation and representation to get them to sign it. Right? That's when we're getting the confirmation signed today. We've got to change that practice. The minute that it's created, as of December 1 or later, we've got to get the disclosure made and get permission to proceed in writing. REA has created a couple of new forms to get that consent. Forms 325 and 326. 325 is for sellers, 326 is for buyers. You can see the form on your screen for a seller. You can probably appreciate how to fill this out. You know, you fill in the blanks and you get the client to initial the proper oval. Now you've got consent to proceed in writing. So you see the only difference here. We do all of these things today. With regards to multiple rep, we just have to change the timing. Some of you are saying, you're going to ask me, Ray, can we get these disclosure documents, 325 and 326, at the time we sign the listing or the time we sign a VRA? And the answer is no. The legislation doesn't say consumers can consent to multiple rep before it's created. The legislation says when it's created. So you've got to use these forms when it's created. You can't get somebody to agree to it before it's created. All right? So by way of summary, do everything you do right now with regards to the disclosure of multiple rep. You just have to make it sooner than we do currently. The next topic, guys, is a relatively easy one with regards to this new document in real estate called the Information Guide that RICO is authoring. You've got two obligations with regards to the info guide. Here they are. One, give every single consumer a copy of the guide. In the case of a client, before you provide them any services. In the case of an SRP, before you provide them with any help. So give every single consumer a copy of the Information Guide. That's your first obligation. The second is this: review it with them. Now, I don't mean read it word for word, but you've got to walk them through it. We do that with documents today, don't we? We walk our consumers through documents before they sign them. That's easy stuff. Give everybody a copy of the guide and review it with them. That's all TRESA requires. Did I say that TRESA requires how you provide consumers with this guide? I didn't, did I? So if you want to print this off and give them a hard copy, that's cool. If you want to send them an email with a PDF of the info guide attached, that's okay. Remember back to that fictitious example I created with that buyer? And the third paragraph in my email said, here's a link to some information that we're going to talk about when we meet. Guess what that link was? It was the Information Guide. See how easily I got rid of half of my obligation under TRESA. I gave the consumer a link in which they could download the info guide right away. Did I say the regulations require you to get the Information Guide signed? That is, the consumer acknowledges having received a copy of it and you explained it to them. I didn't, did I? There's no requirement in TRESA that clients sign that you gave them this. Now, it's probably a best practice to do that, isn't it? On the info guide, guys, RICO is in fact going to put a signature section. That's not required in legislation, as I said, but if you think it's a best practice to avoid any he said, she said situations, the guide itself will have a signature section. REA is working with a realtor, has a new initial section on it, as you can see on your screen, where you can have a buyer or seller initial that you gave them a copy of the guide and you reviewed it with them. But your obligations are simply to give it to every consumer and review it with them. If you go above and beyond the legislation, that's cool. So let's have a look, guys, at what the legislation says needs to be in this info guide. First, it provides a lot of information about all of the benefits of being a client. And then it goes on to say, if you do become a client, here's the duties and obligations that the brokerage owes to you. And this is a two-way street. It says to the client, when you become a client of a brokerage, you have obligations to the brokerage. If you're a seller signing a listing agreement, you have an obligation to pay. If you're a buyer who signs a BRA, you have an obligation to refer any inquiry about any property whatsoever that's of interest to you to the brokerage. And then here it is, guys. It says, if you're thinking about becoming self-represented, if you're thinking about choosing to represent yourself, not be a client, here's all the risks you need to be able to stomach. And it gives examples. The guide is going to give consumers examples. It's going to say, if you're a buyer and you need my help determining market value, that is what you should offer. Sorry, you chose to be self-represented. If you're a buyer and you're wondering whether or not that basement apartment in the house you're interested in is legal or not, sorry, you're on your own. If you get involved in stressful, heated negotiations and there's a bidding war, sorry, you're on your own. And it even says, guys, to self-represented parties, we cannot help you with real estate documents. So remember earlier when I said we can't help self-represented buyers fill out an agreement of purchase and sale? It's not going to be a shock to them when you can't do this for them, because in the information guide, it tells them we can't help you with real estate documents. That is what we do for clients. They're not going to hear that once, they're going to hear it twice. They're going to see it in the info guide, and then they're going to see it on that information and disclosure form, aren't they? Then the information guide is going to zero in on some of the terms of our written agreements with our clients. Written agreements are the BRA and the listing, aren't they? It's going to say to consumers, know what you're signing, read what you're signing, look at the expiry date, know how long the agreement lasts. And well, some of us probably say, well, Ray, that goes without saying. This is in response to the number of consumers who complain that they didn't know their agreement was for so long. So they're told, check out the expiry date. You're responsible for knowing what you're signing. And then the expectation within TRESA is that our written agreements provide termination language, if we're going to allow it. So if a consumer wants the ability to be able to cancel a listing or a BRA, they need to talk to us about it. And we can agree, or we might not agree. Just because a consumer asks us to have the ability to cancel an agreement doesn't mean we have to agree, does it? Right now, in the BRA or in the listing, you see termination language. You don't currently, do you? However, the expectation of TRESA is that if you do agree, it can't be verbal, it can't be a handshake, it's got to be in the written agreement. And then the scope of the agreement is provided as information. Well, what's the scope of an agreement mean? Well, let's think of a BRA. What's the scope of a BRA? Well, the geographic location, isn't it? So consumers are going to be told, when you're signing a BRA, know the geographic location you're agreeing to. And again, this is in response to the number of complaints that the regulator gets, where clients say, I didn't know I signed a BRA with Ray for all of southwestern Ontario. I thought I was just signing a BRA for Port Dover, Ontario, but now I find out and I signed something for all of southwestern Ontario. So they're told, know the scope of the agreement. And then, guys, there's a lot of discussion in the info guide about remuneration. Remuneration is the new big word, the fancy word in legislation for commission. So it's going to say something like this. Real estate remuneration is not a set number by any body in Ontario. Real estate remuneration is always negotiable between the brokerage and the client. That's not anything new. We all know that. But it's going to go on to say to consumers, look, the way that real estate remuneration is calculated must be spelled out in the agreement. And I think, I'm not positive, but I think there's going to be information in the info guide that says to consumers, you can ask for different remuneration in different circumstances. But what does that mean? Well, we get asked that all the time, don't we? Sellers sometimes say to us, hey Ray, if you double end it, will you do it for a point less? That's an example of different remuneration in different circumstances. But remember that new animal self-represented party in legislation? You may get questions from sellers that say, hey Ray, if you just help an SRP, let's say their lawyer actually writes the agreement and you don't, I don't think you're entitled to the full freight we contracted you for. We don't think you're entitled to the cooperating broker's remuneration if you just simply help an SRP. To which I can say yes or no. I don't have to agree. But if I do agree, I have to capture that agreement, that arrangement in writing. It It can't be verbal, it can't be a handshake. And then guys, designated rep is going to be a reality come December 1. And if you are appointed, for example, a designated rep on a listing, and you go on vacation for a couple of weeks, and somebody else needs to step in and be the designated agent for your seller client, the seller client has to agree in writing to that changed designated rep. The brokerage can't just say, hey Ray, while your realtor goes on vacation, we're substituting somebody else. You have to get the permission of the seller for that changed designated rep. It's the seller's decision that that's okay. And then lastly, there's a lot of discussion in the info guide about multiple rep. I'm not going to rehash what we already talked about. We had a big discussion about multiple rep. We're clear on that. And then the guide ends, guys, by saying, hey, look, if you have a concern as a consumer in a real estate transaction, you can reach out to the brokerage management. Like sometimes consumers don't know when they're interacting with a single realtor that there's somebody else in the brokerage who might address a concern that they have. So consumers are going to be informed that there's somebody at the brokerage who might be able to address a concern. Reach out to the brokerage first. Try to resolve your concern with the brokerage first. And then it says, here's how to file a complaint with RICO. All right? Now, guys, I know you want to see the info guide. It's going to be a big document. It's a lot of pages. Remember, we have an obligation to explain all of these pieces of information to consumers. However, it's not readily available on the RICO website yet. So keep checking back to rico.on.ca to see the info guide, to be able to wrap your minds around what's in it. It should be up there any day now. Let's advance to a discussion of how the discipline committee is changing. Right now, guys, if you're found negligent by the discipline committee, the discipline committee can issue a monetary penalty against you and or make you take continuing education. The registrar, on the other hand, can suspend, apply conditions to, or revoke your registration. Fast forward to December 1, the discipline committee itself will have the same authority as the registrar. The discipline committee too will be able to suspend, revoke, or apply conditions to your registration. Right now, the discipline committee composition is 3 members. As of December 1, that's changing. It's increasing in size to 5 or more members. And lastly, if you're ever found negligent by RICO's discipline committee, you can appeal. If you thought they got it wrong, you can appeal. Appeals today are heard by RICO's appeals committee. As of the 1st of December, that changes. Appeals will be heard by an independent quasi-judicial tribunal, and that is the Licenses Appeals Tribunal. And the regulator will have new power and tools. The first thing you guys might find this hard to believe, but currently RICO doesn't have the ability to look into a registrant's conduct and refer a matter to the discipline committee unless there's a written complaint. That changes as of the 1st of the month, where RICO will in fact be able to look into a registrant's conduct whether or not there's a complaint. The next one is this. The RICO website is going to have additional information about registrants. Right now, you can look at the RICO website, you see your name is registered with RICO, you see the name of your employing brokerage, you see the address of the headquarters of your employing brokerage and their contact info, right? And if you've ever been found negligent of a RICO discipline committee, the results of that hearing are up there for all to see. As of December 1, there's going to be more information for consumers to see. If there's even a proposal that your registration have conditions applied to it, it be suspended or revoked, that proposal will be posted there. Just the proposal. You haven't even had your registration affected yet, but it's a warning to consumers. Hey, this registrant is accused of something so egregious that we're proposing to do this to his registration. And lastly, the additional power or tool, I guess I should say, that the registrar has is that they will in fact now be able to reach out to the brokerage and say, hey, we want transactional data from you. For example, they can reach out as of December 1 and say, hey, we want to know how many transactions you participated in the last 12 months, how many involved multiple rep, how many times did you help an SRP, and as a broker of record, when Rico knocks and asks me for transactional data, I have to give it to them because the law says so. All right? The next thing is my favorite part. This is real life stuff that we're going to be encountering all the time, and that is a new option for sellers to consider when they're selling their properties. So right now, guys, you know that in a bidding war, when the seller receives competing offers, they have to tell all buyers who submitted a written offer the number of offers they received, right? You have to tell all buyers the number of written offers. That doesn't change. That remains the same in TRESA, exactly the way it is in REBA. But here's what does change. Sellers have a new option in that the barrier to sharing the contents of competing offers is removed. By that I mean a seller can turn to you as a listing agent and say, I want you to tell all the buyers this information about this offer or these offers. Now it's just an option, guys. Sellers don't have to share. They can if they want. If they want to conduct a blind bidding process the way they do it now, they can. It's totally up to them. But here's what you really do need to know. The sellers don't have to pick a lane. There's no rules in TRESA that says a seller has to tell you before they receive offers whether or not they're going to share the terms of competing offers. They can do whatever they want whenever they want. So imagine this, guys. I'm a listing agent. You're a buyer's agent. Your buyer submits an offer. I call you and I say, hey, there's 10 offers for the seller's consideration. We're presenting them tonight at 6 p.m. And you say, hey, Ray, is the seller going to share the terms of any of these offers? And I say, she told me she's not. She thinks that conducting a blind bidding process will get her the most amount of money. So you proceed on that basis. I present all 10 offers. And then when I'm done presenting those 10 offers, the seller turns to me and says, Ray, I want you to tell everybody that the best purchase price I saw was $1 million. Am I going to have some ticked off buyers and some ticked off buyers agents? I am, aren't I? Because you were told that the seller wasn't going to share the terms of competing offers, and she just did. Did I do anything wrong as the seller's agent? I did I? Because the legislation doesn't require the seller to pick a lane. The seller can do whatever she wants, whenever she wants. So we need to know that. What do we need to do when we're working with buyers, guys? As of December 1, we're going to have to fully educate our buyers about this new option for sellers. They're not going to know about it in all likelihood, are they? So we're going to have to tell them, hey, in a bidding war, sellers can share the terms of your offer with other buyers. And then I think this is what we need to ask them. I think this is critical that we turn to our buyer clients and say, how would it make you feel if the seller shared the terms of your offer with other buyers? Like literally, how would that make you feel? And I think you're going to have two kinds of buyers. Some buyers are going to say, you know what, Ray? I just want to try to buy the property. Let's play by the rules of the seller's game. I'm going to put my best foot forward. I'm going to roll the dice, and I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. But we're also going to have other buyers who say, no way do I want anybody to know the terms of my offer. No way do I want somebody to know my proposed purchase price so that they can try to outbid me. We're going to have both kinds of buyers, aren't we? So guys, what are we going to do when we're working with buyers in that latter category? Those buyers who don't want the terms of their offer shared, but they still want to put forward an offer. OREA is rolling out a new clause for your consideration, for you to recommend to your buyers who are opposed to this process. And I don't have the clause verbatim, guys, but it goes something like this. In the event that the seller shares the terms of my offer with any other buyers, my offer becomes null and void. Now, do you see the intent of that clause? It's to put pressure on the seller not to share the terms of that buyer's offer, isn't it? That's what it's designed to do. To try to turn off a seller from sharing the terms of that buyer's offer. Now that clause doesn't mean that the seller can't share the terms of that buyer's offer. The clause just says, you share my offer, it becomes null and void. Now, while there's no rule that obligates a seller to pick a lane, there's 3 rules about what they can and can't disclose. Here's those 3 rules. The first one is this. If the seller is going to share the terms of competing offers, every buyer who submitted a written offer must receive the same disclosure. So if the seller receives 10 offers and the seller didn't like 3 of them, the seller can't say, don't tell those 3 this information, only tell the remaining 7. We can't do that. TRESA says we have to tell all 10 buyers. All 10 buyers have to get the same info. The second thing, guys, is that TRESA doesn't say what parts of an offer can or can't be shared. It's entirely up to the seller. The seller can share as little or as much as the seller wants. Nowhere in TRESA does it say you can only disclose X, Y, and Z. It's whatever the seller wants. Some sellers are going to disclose the price only. Some sellers are going to disclose the price and the closing date. Some sellers might disclose the price, the deposit, the closing date, the fact that there were no conditions. It's whatever they want. The only thing they can't disclose, and this is the third rule, is any information that would lead to the personal identity of the buyer. Well, what's that? The buyer's name, clearly. And if the buyer had a house to sell, if we disclosed the address of the buyer's house, we as realtors could certainly figure out who that buyer was by their home address, couldn't we? So that's this new option in a nutshell, guys. It is just an option. Sellers don't have to pick a lane. That is, they don't have to tell you whether or not they're going to share the terms. REA has rolled out a new clause to put pressure on a seller not to share the terms of a buyer's offer. And then there's 3 little rules with regards to what information can be shared and how it can be shared. Now see this new document on your screen, guys? It's called Form 209, Seller Direction to Share Substance of Competing Offers. It speaks for itself and how to fill this out, right? You just fill in the sections of this form that the seller wants you to disclose. You have the seller initial it, you have the seller to sign it. Now you have the seller's written direction as to what they want disclosed. Now, I'm going to walk you through a scenario to make sure you fully understand that new REA clause, because we've got to get this one right. Remember, you have an obligation under TRESA to tell all buyers the number of competing offers. So let me ask you guys this. Think about this question. If a seller receives 10 competing offers, 10 written offers, and 3 of those 10 have that revocation clause, that clause that makes the offer null and void, how many offers are there on the table for the seller's consideration? There's 10 offers, 3 of them have the revocation clause. How many offers are there for the seller's consideration? Think about that for 5 seconds. When I make this presentation in person, guys, I get a very mixed variety of answers. People say 7, others say 10. And that's why I'm going through this example, to make sure you fully understand this clause. The correct answer is there's 10 offers for the seller's consideration. Just because a buyer inserted a clause that says my offer becomes null and void if you disclose the terms of my offer, doesn't mean the existence of that clause in an offer makes it null and void automatically, because that would be the equivalent of no offer being submitted. That clause only becomes effective if the seller in fact shares the terms of that buyer's offer. So that's why there's 10 offers. You got to clearly understand that clause. Now guys, the REA clause has a specific ramification. The offer will become null and void. There are different variations that I'm hearing of out there in the marketplace of that clause. Other clauses may have different consequences. So read that clause word for word to know truly what that clause is going to do. What does that clause trigger to have happen? The next thing is this. You guys need to fully understand. We need to be aware that the disclosure we receive might not tell the whole story. What do I mean by that? If I'm a listing agent and I give you this form where I filled out price and I put in there $2 million, should you tell your buyer that the best offer on the table was $2 million firm? You should you? Why? Remember, the seller can pick and choose how much information they share. Sure, the best purchase price might have been $2 million, but that offer for $2 million had 10 conditions in it. There was no way the seller was going to accept an offer with 10 conditions in it. But the seller doesn't have to tell you that while it was the best price, it really wasn't a great offer because it had 10 conditions. So be very careful that you don't lead buyers to believe that the disclosure they're receiving tells the whole story. There's a lot of what-ifs with this process, guys. We don't have time to walk through all of them. This is something you should be doing back at your brokerages, brainstorming this stuff. What if this, what if that? We need to become familiar with it. The next thing, guys, is a really easy conversation. It's about what needs to be in our written agreements. What are written agreements? Remember, the BRA and the listing agreement. The legislation says this: any written agreement must clearly, comprehensively, and prominently set out the following. In the case of a listing agreement, remuneration payable to any other brokerage. Well, I know what you're thinking, Ray, the listing agreement already does that. There's a blank for the total remuneration. There's a blank for the portion of the total remuneration offered to a cooperating broker. You're right. Our REA listing agreement does that currently. The spirit of this legislation, however, is this: the size of the cooperating broker's remuneration is the decision of the seller. Right? It's not our decision as the brokerage. So, for example, I may say to a seller, the fee for my services, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, is 5 apples. I am recommending to you that 2.5 of those 5 apples be offered to other brokerages on the MLS. Is that okay with you? And if they say yes, we're golden. However, if that seller says no, Ray, it's a tough market. We want 3 of those 5 apples to be offered on the cooperating broker's remuneration. I have a decision to make. Either I agree with the seller or I guess I don't take the listing, right? The intention here is the size of the cooperating broker's remuneration is that of the seller, and it needs to be clearly laid out in the written agreement. The next thing is this. Remember how we talked about circumstances in which remuneration payable may change? I may say to a seller, I'm not going to charge you the cooperating broker's remuneration if I just help an SRP buyer. It can't be verbal, can't be a handshake. I got to capture that in the written agreement. What am I going to see? A schedule to the listing agreement where I can outline a different remuneration for a different circumstance. The next one's a huge one, guys. The services that the brokerage will provide under the agreement. The expectation of RICO is this. Let's use a listing agreement as an example. If I'm listing a property for sale and I say to the seller, I'm going to post your property on MLS in 12 hours. I'm going to pay for professional photography. I'm going to have an open house once a month until your property is sold. That those services be captured in the written agreement, in the listing agreement. We don't do that currently, generally, do we? We have a marketing clause in the REA listing agreement, but it basically just says the seller authorizes us to use our best efforts to market the property for sale however we see fit during current market conditions. Fast forward to December 1, RICO expects those services that we've talked to that seller client about to be outlined clearly, comprehensively, and prominently. And then remember when we talked about sellers or buyers who might want to cancel their agreements with us. As I mentioned in a previous slide, if we agree to allow somebody to cancel their agreement, can't be verbal, can't be a handshake, we got a contract for that in the written agreement. And lastly, as you know, the expiry date of our written agreements today have to be initialed by the clients when they're greater than 6 months. As of December 1, they've got to be initialed by the clients no matter the term. 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, initial them every time. All right? Now, a lot of people say to me, Ray, what happens to our written agreements on the effective date of December 1? Your client agreements can continue on as usual because there's no change to client relationships in TRESA. However, if you have an existing customer agreement on December 1, that customer agreement can continue until the earlier of its expiry date in the agreement, or March 30th, whatever is sooner. the earlier up the expiry date or March 30th. So if you've got a customer service agreement today that expires February 15th, it expires February 15th. But if you've got one that goes until June 1, it expires automatically on March 30th. All right? And our last topic, before we jump into any Q&As, is designated rep. As I mentioned, this is something a real lobby for as far back as 2017. So what is it? It will allow a brokerage who has more than one client in connection with the same trade to designate, to appoint a different agent from the brokerage to advocate for and represent the respective clients without the limitations of multiple rep. I know that's a mouthful, so let's use an example here. Let's say again, I'm working at your brokerage. We work together at XYZ Realty. And I list a property for sale today. And you are working with a buyer who puts an offer in on our listing. Because we work at XYZ Realty together, we have multiple representation, don't we? And what happens in multiple representation today? The buyer and seller receive limited services, don't they? The buyer and seller are in a conflict of interest situation because they have competing interests. So they receive reduced services from us. We can't give them our opinion or our advice regarding matters pertaining to money or motivation. That's multiple rep 101. Fast forward to December 1. If the brokerage permits designated rep, here's how we facilitate that. Let's take a look at the listing agreement on your screen. See that new third line at the top of the listing agreement, which I've got highlighted? The seller can insert my name there. Ray Ferris goes right on that blank line. At that point, I'm the designated agent for the seller. Only me. The rest of you who work at XYZ Realty with me are no longer representatives of the seller the way you are today with brokerage representation under REVA. You're impartial to the seller. I'm the only one that's representing the seller. BRAs, same thing. There's a third new line on the BRA. The buyer inserts your name on a BRA. You're the representative. You're the agent for the buyer. The rest of us at XYZ Realty, we are not representing that buyer the way we are now. So, if you and I work at XYZ Realty, I have a listing signed on behalf of XYZ Realty. You have a BRA signed on behalf of XYZ Realty. Your buyer makes an offer on our brokerage's listing in designated rep. That is not multiple rep. At that point, it's not multiple rep. And as a result of no multiple representation being created, you can fully advocate for and represent the buyer. I can fully advocate for and represent the seller. When the buyer says to you, what should I offer on Ray's listing? You can answer it. Whereas you couldn't answer that today in brokerage representation, could you? So what does designated representation do? It gives our clients access to all of our services, all of our advice, all of our opinions. That's what they want, isn't it? Like when I say to a seller today, these 100 other people that work in my brokerage with me, they're also representing you. Sellers are confused by that. They're like, what do you mean they're representing me? I don't even know these people. I'm never going to meet these people. But that's brokerage representation, isn't it? Whereas when we act in designated rep, I'm the representative. Now some of you are going to ask me, well, where does the brokerage fit into this? Where does a brokerage fit into designated representation? The brokerage is still responsible for the services of the agreement. The brokerage is responsible for the services. You as the designated agent, you're responsible for the representation. All right? Now guys, if you're a designated rep of a client, you have to safeguard the confidential information of the client. What do I mean by that? If your brokerage has an open air atmosphere where if we all work together, and you can hear me sitting on my cell phone talking to my seller, and you hear me talking to my seller about the reason that they're selling, that they bought another house closing in 30 days from and they really need this house sold, the brokerage has to offer infrastructure where I can have a phone conversation in private space where you guys can't hear me. All right, so brokerages have a lot of thought here. Now, we've got the best of both worlds here in Ontario with regards to representation of our clients. Consumer choice has been preserved in TRESA. What do I mean by that? Jump to bullet point number 5. We've talked about the other 4 already. Multiple representation, guys, can continue to exist in the interest of consumer choice. What do I mean by that? So let's say I know you. I've known you for 20 years. And I call you and I say, hey, I want to buy a house in your city. I'm moving to your city. And so we go out and look at houses, and you find me a house that I fall in love with. I want to buy it. But guess what? The house that I want to buy, you have listed for sale. And you're the designated agent, you're the designated rep for the seller. If multiple representation were still not a consumer choice after December 1, you would have to say to me, sorry buddy, I can't make an offer for you. I can't represent you in the purchase of this home because I'm already the seller's agent. To which I would say, what? I've known you for 20 years. I know you, I like you, I trust you, I know you have my back. And you'd have to say, sorry pal, you've got to go work with another agent. To which I'm going to say, I don't want to work with another agent. And you're going to have to say, or you would have had to say rather, sorry, my hands are tied. The law doesn't allow it. But that's not what the government decided. The government says multiple representation can continue to exist even when designated representation is the brokerage model, because that's what the consumer wants. If I say to you, in my example, I'm cool with you also acting for the seller, and I agree to that in writing, and the seller agrees to that in writing, the rules of multiple rep today, everything's cool. I can work with the realtor I know, like, and trust, as can the seller. Let's summarize. All of this stuff, guys, comes into December 1, not sooner. Don't do any of these things until December the 1st. The Code of Ethics is only 2 pages long. Remember, on December 1, customers cease to exist. You're either a client of the brokerage or you're a nobody. And remember, if a consumer is hell-bent on being self-represented, you're going to present them with a self-represented party acknowledgement form that says to them, the only reason I'm helping you is because it's a service to my client. And oh, by the way, any help I give you does not use my skill or judgment. And then there's 3 little rules, those 3 little requirements for disclosures. Not anything we need to worry too much about because AREA's forms will have our back. You'll recall that as of December 1, we've got to give everybody a copy of the info guide and explain it to them. And then we talked about the fact that sellers have a new option to sell their properties. And we just finished up a discussion of designated rep. Now, we have very little time for questions, but I want to show you how you can get your questions answered beyond today. REA.com/TRESA. It's your one-stop shop for all things TRESA. Today, tomorrow, next week, next year. Here's what you're going to find there. A video series called TRESA in 2. There's 20 videos currently there. We're going to add more. We call them TRESA in 2 because none of those videos are longer than 2 minutes in length. They're down and dirty, they're raw and real. We have a discussion about all of these topics and others that we walked through this morning. I encourage you to watch them. Angie and Mark say things and explain things and use different examples than I do, differently. You've learned something from them as well. Then there's a section on there, frequently asked questions. We receive questions from around the province. We answer them right on the website. That list is growing all the time, so check that out. And my favorite part of the site is this, guys. Reach out. If you click on that Get in Touch button, you can ask REA any question that you want. And within 24 hours, you will receive a written reply to your email. So feel free to use this section. I know we've only got 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'm going to turn things over to Julia at REA to ask me a couple of questions. Let's focus in on the ones where you've received them several times, Julia, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Ray, for that amazing presentation once again. We have a lot of questions here. I'm going to try to start with some very quick ones. Okay, what impact will the change in customer agreements, how will customer agreements impact mere posting companies?
Yeah, so a mere posting is not for a customer. A mere posting is in fact a client service. So mere postings are in effect limited services provided to a client. So mere postings are not customer relationships. So you can continue to accept mere postings on behalf of seller clients. There's no change.
Okay, will working with a realtor be revised to define SRP versus client?
Yeah, for sure. As if you guys if you'd like to have a look at it, just go to aria.com/TRESA, scroll down to the standard forms section, and you can download all of AREA's revised and new forms. So you can check out the Working with a Realtor form today at that website.
Okay. This one came up a lot about implied agency with an SRP. So members are asking, we cannot create implied agency with an SRP because we can't provide our skills and advice to an SRP, but in order to have implied agency, we need to use those skills and provide that advice. Otherwise, how is it considered implied?
Well, implied agency is defined in legislation under the term client, which means the things you say and the things you do create implied agency. Now, look, if a consumer says, Ray, I don't want to be a client, I don't want anything from you, you're not going to be able to accept them as a client whether or not there's a written agreement. So, you've really got to make sure that somebody does want services from you. And there's no template solution for how you do that. I used one particular example, right? But you've got to find out from consumers whether or not they want services from you. So the question I really wasn't sure of, but I want to be clear. Implied agency is alive and well. The vast majority of realtors that I go out and speak to tell me that they prefer to build relationships before they ask somebody to sign a DRA contract. And that's acceptable. Yes, I get it. I want to repeat one more time. The gold standard is to get that BRA signed at the earliest practical opportunity. In an ideal world, in a textbook case scenario, you get that signed before you go out and show buyers properties, right? But that doesn't mean if you don't, that you don't have a client on your hands.
Okay, so that kind of segues into this question then. If we can't enter into a written agreement with an SRP, how can we rely on a BRA to get paid? Wouldn't the APS be a written agreement?
The written agreement, the APS is not an agreement with the brokerage. The APS is simply an agreement between a buyer and a seller. The brokerage is not a party to the APS. If you want to be assured that you're going to get paid when you take a buyer out and show them properties, yeah, you need that BRA signed. If you don't get a BRA signed and the buyer does something crazy like buys the property from another brokerage, you don't have a claim under implied agency to seek out remuneration. You want remuneration, get that BRA signed.
And can an SRP change their mind and become a client in the middle of negotiation?
Yes, they can. Yeah, if somebody in the heat of the moment says, I'm in over my head, I made a bad decision here, I want to become a client, they can do that.
Okay. How does, so for an SRP, how does this impact realtor websites that provide listings or require people to register to receive properties automatically sent to them? These people are most often SRPs, but it seems that would be providing a service.
So let me be clear. At that point, that person receiving a drip campaign of new listings in real time is neither an SRP or a client. You're only providing them with information. Listings are information. That's it. This is no different than somebody walking into an open house. At that point, they're not an SRP. They're not a client. They're a consumer who's walked in. And you can give them all the listing details about that house. That's simply information. However, if they start asking you questions that require your opinion or your advice, then you're treading into client territory. You might be creating implied agency when you answer questions of a buyer, you've got to be careful not to cross that fine line. We've got to be careful not to cross that fine line today in converting a customer into a client. So, guys, we can continue to provide listing information to consumers. They're not a client, they're not an SRP at that point. Simple information is not with respect to a trade. Let's try to remember it that way. These regulations, these TRESA regulations pertain to a trade in real estate. Information, giving people lots of listings, is not specific to a trade at that point.
So what happens to clients who signed up prior to December 1st? Do these rules apply? Do they need new contracts?
Yeah, so the existing written agreements for clients as of December 1 can continue forward exactly the way they are because there is no change to client relationships. It is customer agreements that have a transition period. Remember that March 30th date I said, guys? Your existing customer relationships as of December 1 can continue until no later than March 30th. If the expiry date in your existing customer agreement is earlier than March 30th, the earlier date applies. So client agreements continue on because there's no change to client relationships. There's only a change for customers. And they can continue, as I said, until not later than March 30th.
Okay, perfect. Now we have a lot of questions from members about how designated representation is going to work with a team if you have a bunch of people involved.
Yeah, so guys, this is a heavy lift for teams. My advice for you here is to go to the RICO website, watch their video series number 4, or download the transcript. RICO has created incredible guidance that answers that type of question and lots of others. It's an exhaustive piece. They've done an incredibly good job, so I'd encourage you to go to the RICO website and look at video number 4. On the AREA website, we answer that question and many others specifically about designated reps. So the answers and many others are right there. There's no template solution. Teams have to think about this. Teams might have to change their structure, infrastructure even of their offices, right? So it's not a simple answer. Teams have a lot of thinking to do.
Okay. And then in terms of using designated rep and when that becomes multiple rep, I think some members wanted to know, so if someone has a listing and they're the designated rep, and then someone in their brokerage is a buyer who wants to purchase the home and they have a BRA and are identified as a designated rep, is that now multiple rep?
No, it's not multiple rep. In designated rep, the only time you would ever have multiple rep in a designated representation brokerage is when the same agent is the designated agent for the seller and the buyer. But if I'm working at your brokerage and I'm the designated agent for the seller and you've got a BRA with a buyer, we don't have multiple rep because the brokerage is no longer responsible for the representation. It's the agent listed as the designated agent responsible for the representation. You do not have multiple rep in a designated rep brokerage, I repeat, unless it's the same agent, the same designated agent representing both parties.
And another one about multiple rep. So if someone has a seller client and a buyer contacts them directly to see the property and wants to make an offer, do they need to get them both to consent to multiple rep before starting on the buyer's offer?
Look, that's really going to boil down to a brokerage decision. The brokerage, as a broker of record, I've been writing all kinds of policies that answer those types of questions for the representatives in my brokerage. There's nothing in TRESA that says exactly what would trigger multiple rep. For example, here's how it's going to work in my brokerage. If a buyer simply looks at one of our brokerage's listings and they're working with an agent from my brokerage under brokerage representation, by the mere fact that they're just looking, I'm not going to consider that multiple rep at that point. Other brokerages may say, no, our policy will be when somebody looks When a buyer client of our brokerage looks at one of our seller clients' listings, by the virtue of the fact that they booked an appointment, we're going to consider that multiple rep. But as I was saying, in my brokerage, I'm not going to consider multiple rep created until that buyer starts to express interest. They start to ask me questions. They say things like, Ray, we like this. We think we're going to make an offer. We're going to think about this. So the answer really depends upon how the brokerage management wants to identify when multiple rep is created. TRESA itself doesn't say, here's the trigger. Brokerages have to come up with answers and policies and procedures to guide their salespeople in that scenario.
Okay, we'll do a couple more questions now to address disclosures, and then we'll have to close it down. So a buyer's offer has a clause that does not permit the terms of their offer to be disclosed, and the seller has chosen to disclose terms to all buyers. In this case, does the listing realtor include this buyer's offer in the count of how many offers are on the property?
Yeah, so to the latter part of that question, yes. The listing agent has to include that offer with that clause in the count. However, there was an incorrect statement made in that question. Remember, just because that clause is inserted doesn't automatically make that offer null and void. The only way that offer becomes null and void is if the seller actually discloses terms from that offer. The seller might not decide to share any terms of that offer, which would therefore not trigger it to become null and void. So that's what I meant by be very careful with these clauses and the offer count. I repeat, and I'll summarize, by virtue of the fact that that clause is in there doesn't mean the offer is null and void just because the clause is in there. Something has to happen to make that offer null and void, and that is a disclosure.
So this might be directly related, then I'm not sure if you kind of already answered it with what you said, but what happens if a buyer insists that they don't want the substance of their offer to be shared, and they also don't want their offer to be null and void if the seller discloses any information of said buyer's offer?
So all I can say to that is REA has not recommended any other solution at this point. We were recommending the clause. The only other thing that I think I've heard of is that a buyer could potentially ask a seller to sign a non-disclosure agreement before they submit the offer. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a contract expert, I'm not a contract lawyer. I don't know exactly how that will work out. If you are going to consider a non-disclosure agreement, as per that question, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to your broker of record or legal advice.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray. That's all the time we have now for questions, but please make sure that you guys visit aria.com/TRESA because we have a lot of guides and other resources, as Ray mentioned, and we're going to be updating that website regularly as new resources become available over the coming months.
Thanks, everybody, and remember, reach out section, as Julia and I said, where we'll answer your questions in 24 hours.
Okay. 哎，在抢 offer 的时候，如果还是取决于，
让几分钟稍微讨论一下吧。
还是取决于卖家，卖家只要说不披露就不披露。
对，而且还可以改主意。
对，我知道。
那这个卖家一般都是 follow listing agent 的 instruction， 他一般会让我怎么说对我有利，我是披露有利还是不披露有利，然后这个 listing agent 就批了，就说我们卖家决定什么什么，但其实卖家就一定是比卖的高，怎么卖的高怎么来。
正常还是不披露的，
不一定，
不一定是吗？
你已经如果有一个足够高的，
可以披露。
对，比如你想卖180，你已经有人给你200了，你已经可以接了，你就可以告诉大家，现在最高的200，有人超过200，我就接，不挺好的吗？
因为他刚才举了例子，100万的 offer 有10个肯定行。
对啊，我说披露架构没披露条件的。
对。但是他刚才说的就是是不是得给每一个 buyer 说一下？
对，就是你披露任何东西，就跟以前一样，大家要一口公平。
对，是。
对。 这个是要
最后那个女的问的，她说那个买家不同意，比如说这个 offer 是我提的，我不同意披露。她刚才说这没有解决方案。
这个在这个体系下没有解决方案，
没有解决方案。
在 RECO 和 OREA 体系下没有。就是我是 buyer， 我不同意你披露。
但如果你的 offer 都不是最高价，我披露的压根就不是你的 offer， 我披露的是最高价。如果最高价的人没有写这句话，我同样可以去披露。就你可以 void， 但你的 offer 我根本都不在乎你，除非你给的很高，别人是200，你220，那你说我不让披露，那我也 OK， 对吧？但如果你不是最高价，我才不在乎你这个东西怎么说。
但是就比如说那个最高价，举个例子啊，
就最高价
他不一定
披露。
对，你想披露那200的，那200的说不行，你不要披露。是不是这怎么办？
最高价他不会知道自己是最高价，这是抢 offer 的时候，如果业主先选择
不
崩盘，
咱们不说你那种情况，就说他这种情况。
可以啊。
就是最高价那个人不允许披露。
可以啊，那你
那就不能批啊。
不是啊，他没有给你答案。
对，我知道，就是这个，就是没有说怎么做嘛，项目里面对吧
？OREA没有说。
但是有可能会遇到。
那就跟现在操作一样的，就是盲盘。
就是不披露。
现在就是盲盘，现在就是不披露价钱。
我确认一下，我刚才听了，我理解的不对啊。我以为是，比如说你要披露的话，比如说这5个 offer 分别是多少钱，要披露就得都披露。
不是，
没有，
你可以选择性披露。
你就只披露某一个。
你可以全披露，然后你也可以披露一个，然后你甚至你披露了一个，你可以披露价钱，你可以披露 condition。
对，这我就理解，我以为是。
但是你披露必须告诉所有的已经交 offer 的人，
你要
披露任何东西要告诉大家所有的人，这是他的要求。
就信息给批的。
而且在披露之前，必须要让卖家去确认签字，然后你才能做这个事，是吧？
卖家没有说要签字的。
我看有个表嘛，我看有个表，有好几
consent，
对吧？
没有说写的。
所以那个表要是我的话，我会打印好几份儿，在 multiple offer。
就是啊，我是觉得好麻烦，就是你可能这么一个小事情，还要签个字，一会儿签个字。
对呀，你可以最后签的。
补伤是吧？反正只对卖家有利嘛。
就跟咱们似的，只有在最后接的时候你才签字，在最后一块儿签。
而且他刚才说那个 buyer 是不是需要 buyer 的 consent 可以 disclose 他这个信息？
买家才能。
不需要啊。